Okay, so here is your warm-up for special quadrilaterals that we covered yesterday. This is very reflective of the types of things you're going to have to do on the quiz momentarily over the definitions, and I told you yesterday that it's just over these 4 definitions. Don't get it confused with the characteristics, it's just the definitions. So it's these 4 words, and so for the first 2, I want you to draw an example according to the definition. And then for the last 2, I want you to write the appropriate definition in words for those. Okay? So if you need, go ahead and pause. Take about 4 to 5 minutes to finish this, and then start it back up so you can check your answers. Okay, so parallelograms. Definition of parallelograms is a quadrilateral with 2 pairs of opposite parallel sides. So first I'm going to draw a quadrilateral, which is a 4-sided figure. And then the definition said that I need to erase that little piece. It's going to bother me. Whoa, okay. So quadrilateral, and parallelogram says 2 pairs of opposite parallel sides. So there's a pair of opposite parallel sides, and then I have to use doubles to show that it's a different pair of opposite parallel sides. That's just the definition. We're not going to do any of the characteristics about opposite sides being congruent, opposite angles congruent, none of that. It's just the definition. Okay? So done. There's parallelogram. All right, rectangle. What was the definition of a rectangle? You should have a picture of a 4-sided figure, and the definition of rectangle says it's a quadrilateral with 4 right angles. So then you should have a picture similar to that. Don't mark that opposite sides are congruent because it has the same characteristics as a parallelogram. That was just for lunch. I'm doing this during plan period. And so this is all you put in it for the definition, because all the definition says for rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. Done. Okay? All right, so now we're going to write out the appropriate definition. So square. So you should have written something like a quadrilateral, and you can put quad for short, or if you said a 4-sided figure, that works too. So a quadrilateral with 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. Okay, so that was the proper definition for a square. So basically what I'm looking for is, this is worth 1 point, but I'm looking for the quadrilateral part because that's basically telling me how many sides it should have. And then what do we know about it? So with 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. Okay? So rhombus, again, is a quadrilateral, so telling me what shape it is. So that's how many sides with 4 congruent sides. Okay, so how many sides? That's the quadrilateral part, or if you said 4-sided figure, that works too, with 4 congruent sides. Okay. If you don't put a quadrilateral, if you just put a shape with 4 congruent sides, that doesn't work. Okay, because any shape, I could have a 5-sided figure and only 4 out of the 5 sides are congruent. That's not a rhombus. Okay, so you have to be specific. All right, so that was your warm-up, and that's what your quiz is going to be over. And so what we're going to do right now is you're going to pack everything or close everything up. Take out a pencil. You do not need a calculator for this quiz, and you're going to go ahead and take this vocabulary quiz. Then we'll go back and look at your worksheet, and I'll do a few questions off of there, just some ones that I think you might struggle on. So yeah, go ahead and pause this after I change it here. So pause it so that it is on this part where we left off yesterday. So go ahead and pause now. All right, so hopefully the quiz went well for you. And so now we are going to go back I know block 1 we left off on this section. I'm going to go back a couple though. So block 1 you can fast forward past this if you need to, because you at least got through example 2. So you can fast forward a little bit so that you can get to the notes for rhombus and do example 3. So for example 2, we got through part A. Since all of these are congruent to each other because the diagonals are congruent in a rectangle and diagonals bisect each other. So if this whole diagonal was 10 and this one was 10, if I cut them in half, they're all going to be 5 pieces, or segments of 5. So part B, FA is 26. So from here to here, this whole diagonal is 26. And I just want to find from L to O. Well, since it's a rectangle, I know that the length FA is going to equal the whole length LT. Okay, so that means LT is going to be 26. So I know LT equals 26. And remember that diagonals bisect each other, so you're going to cut 26 in half. So that means from L to O is going to be half of 26, which is 13. So that's how you use the characteristics of a rectangle. Okay. All right, part C, I know that TO is 4y plus 7. I'll put that in my picture. And FA is 30, and we want to find X. So from F to A, this whole thing is 30. Well, again, if this whole thing is 30 and the diagonals bisect each other, what's each of these pieces going to be? Should be half of 30, which is 15. So all of these pieces are going to be 15. So then what equation could I set up so that I could solve for y? I guess it's y we need to solve for down here. So we would do 4y plus 7 has to equal that 15. So we just used geometry to set up our equation. Now it's an algebra problem. So minus 7, 4y equals 8, divide by 4, so y is 2. And that's all we needed to was to find y. So you're done. Okay? All right, so characteristics of a rhombus. The first thing is that it has all the characteristics of a parallelogram. Okay, so that's first and foremost. So remember, characteristics of a parallelogram is that opposite sides are congruent, which in a rhombus, all 4 sides are the same. So that still holds. Opposite angles are congruent. So in a rhombus, opposite angles will be congruent as well. Let's see what else. We've got consecutive angles will be supplementary. So angles in a parallelogram next to each other would be supplementary, and diagonals bisect each other. So all of those characteristics of a parallelogram also hold true for a rhombus. The one that the rhombus has that's extra that not all parallelograms have is that diagonals are perpendicular. So not only do the diagonals bisect each other, so remember that would be the singles and doubles here, they cut each other in half, but in a rhombus, its special characteristic is that when you draw in the diagonals of a rhombus, it makes a right angle. That's what perpendicular meant. So if you need to pause so that you can copy that down, please do. Another thing that the characteristics of rhombuses have is that diagonals bisect the opposite angles. So if you draw in the diagonals of a rhombus, this diagonal cuts this angle in half. And this diagonal cuts the angle in half. And since these two angles are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, change that there. It's not working. There we go. So since this whole angle and this whole angle are congruent and the diagonal bisects them, that means these 4 little angles, 1, 2, 3, 4, those are all congruent to each other. And since this whole angle and this whole angle, our opposite angles, are congruent, then when you draw on the diagonal, that these 4 little angles here will all be congruent to each other. Okay? So in a rhombus, another special characteristics about the diagonals is that it bisects the angles when you draw them in on a rhombus. And the diagonals are also perpendicular, so they form a right angle when you draw on the diagonals. So you can pause if you need to finish writing that out. Then glue in, if you didn't get a chance to, glue in example 3. I don't have any extras, that's why I gave them to you yesterday and told you to get that in there. All right, so example 3. So on this one, we have a rhombus. SLTM is a rhombus. And we got some numbered angles. So part A says the measure of angle 1 is 25 degrees. So we want to find all the numbered angles. Well, remember that when you do this, the diagonals bisect the angles, which means this angle are congruent, this angle and this angle are congruent. So then the measure of angle 2, according to that, is going to be 25. Because of the characteristic that in a rhombus, the diagonals bisect each other. Okay? Then, we also know that the diagonals are perpendicular, so that I know that this makes a right angle. So then that means that the measure of angle 5 has to be 90 degrees. And this is 25 degrees. I'm labeling my picture. Well, now I have a right triangle. So I could find the measure of angle 3 using this right triangle, because what do we know about the angles in a triangle? They add up to 180. So then if I take these, add them up and subtract from 180, what do I get? You should get 65 degrees. So that means that the measure of angle 3 is 65 degrees. And then again, this diagonal bisects this angle, so that means this angle 3 and this angle 4 and this angle down here will be congruent to this angle. So that means the measure of angle 4 is also 65 degrees. So that's part A. Okay? All right, so now let me erase. Actually, I'm going to keep those angle measures in there, or those arcs and the right angle, because that's going to stay because it's a rhombus. That's the characteristics. Now I'm going to look here. So measure of angle 1 is this angle right here, and it's 3x plus 8. And the measure of angle 2, this angle right here, is 11x minus 24. Well, we kept our marks here because the diagonals bisect the angles, and so since these angles are supposed to be congruent to each other, how do I set up my equation? I set them equal to each other. So 11x minus 24 equals 3x plus 8, because angles 1 and 2 need to be congruent because the diagonals bisect the angles. All right, so I minus 3x and get 8x minus 24 equals 8. Add 24. 8x equals 32. Divide, so x is 4. Now that's all they wanted us to do was find x, so I don't have to plug it back in and find anything else. Okay? All right, and then the last thing is characteristics of a square. Squares are not very original, okay? Squares have every characteristics that the parallelogram has. It has all the characteristics of a rectangle, and it has all the characteristics of a rhombus, because a square is a parallelogram, a rectangle, and a rhombus, okay? Because it's got opposite parallel sides like a parallelogram, so it has all the characteristics that go along with that. A rectangle, squares have 4 right angles like a rectangle, so then it has all the characteristics that a rectangle has. And a square is a rhombus because it satisfies the definition of a rhombus, which means you have 4 congruent sides. And so since it classifies as a rhombus, it has all the characteristics of a rhombus. So a square is very unoriginal. It's got all the characteristics of all of the 3 aforementioned special quadrilaterals. So if you need to pause, you can. And then to finish up notes, I've got this hierarchy that kind of shows you how things play out here. So you've got your quadrilaterals is the big mamma jamma, okay? All 4-sided figures. You've got these branches, parallelograms, trapezoids, and kites. But off of parallelograms, you've got rectangles and rhombuses, because those are all parallelograms, and so is a square. And a square comes from these 2 guys, because squares are like if rectangles and rhombuses had a baby. Okay, so that concludes the notes from yesterday that we did not finish.